Welcome back to our virtual Sunday school class. Grant and Nate are here again to kind of go through Calvinism and the lectures of Abraham Kuyper.
That's right.
And today's lecture, Calvinism and Art, was a fun one.
This was a little harder to distill,
as
we were just chatting about. And yeah, the first section, it was just harder.
Yeah.
All right.
And leave me alone. It was just harder. So I say that we wanted to open with that just to acknowledge that, it's tough slugging.
Yeah.
And the pattern we've kind of laid out, hopefully many of you are following it, is you're reading the lecture or listening to the lecture or both and then coming to this conversation. So if you struggled through this one, know that we did as well.
You're in good company.
You're in good company. As is, I'll read this first quote, which will kind of...
This will set the tone.
This will set the tone for us. Genuflection before an almost fanatical worship of art, such as our time fosters, should little harmonize with the high seriousness of life, for which Calvinism has pleaded, and which it has sealed, not with the pencil or the chisel in the studio, but with its best blood at the stake and in the field of battle. So Grant and I had to look up genuflection.
Yeah, what is that? What is that word?
Which actually just means to bend a knee. So it's like bowing down. So the idea here is art has become an idol.
Yes.
And we see that in our day. So he's writing, 100 years ago, and over 100 years ago, and he's seeing art as the idol. So I think from time to, throughout time, no matter what decade you live in, there's the tendency to make an idol out of art.
Right.
And what he's saying here is he's wanting to remind us that there's a major difference between the artist in the art shop and the faithful men and women who sealed their confession with their own blood.
Right.
And so not to make heroes out of all the artists, just like we make idols out of their art.
Yeah.
To put art in its proper place, but that it is important. And he kind of meanders there. He starts off with, there's a tendency to make an idol out of it, and we shouldn't overemphasize its importance.
Yeah.
But then he comes around to the end by saying, but also don't diminish it.
Yeah.
Right? So that's kind of the flow of this lecture.
Yeah. On page 143, he does say something helpful to show why it does seem that art becomes an idol, or it seems that people are consumed by art sometimes. And we see this, you just said it, but music culture or art culture, Hollywood, or these other places that you see it, you go, people really are consumed by these things. And he says, it is but fair to concede that, threatened with atrophy by materialism and rationalism, the human heart naturally seeks an antidote against this withering process in its artistic instinct. And so this desire for the transcendent, or this desire for something beautiful, something to fill that emotional void or whatever it is, leads them in this direction.
Yeah, right around that quote, he says, unable to grasp the holier benefits of religion, the mysticism of the heart reacts in an art intoxication. Right? Yeah. So there's this idea that those who we're made as beings that worship, and so those who can't grasp true worship, true religion, who aren't connected to God, are grasping at the sort of the sublime, the higher things, and they make that art because it's this sort of transcendent thing. And you see this. You see this in concerts and stuff where there's a trance in people, right? And you see. There's a reason certain movies are called cult classics, right? Because people can identify with a particular character, a particular story. As you said, music. Think about music subculture. I can look at, maybe not anymore, but when I was a teenager, I can look at another teenager, and just by the way they were dressed, I knew exactly what kind of music they listened to, right? Were they a punk rocker? Were they grunge? Were they, whatever? I'm like, oh, you could spot a Nirvana fan a mile away, right? And so it's because of this all-consuming identity, right? Just like Christians find our true identity in the worship of the true and living God, people who aren't connected to the true and living God have a tendency to make an idol out of art because it's something that gives them identity. Right? It gives aesthetic meaning to the world, all that kind of stuff. Right. So that's the danger.
Right.
And he talks about how, first of all, he talks about Calvinism and how Calvin himself was the argument. As the argument goes, Calvin wasn't super into art, so can we just abandon it? Okay,
Right.
so if there's a tendency to get overworked with it, if there's a tendency to make an idol out of it, should we just abandon it?
Yeah.
And he says no.
Yeah, and he argues for the different levels of art too. There is kind of like low passions art, and this is kind of the theater and the ballet is what he says. But that's kind of what we would say even now with things that are exploitive of women or just sinful things. Like it's breaking all the commandments as much as possible. Right? So that's where we're at with
Low
that.
level.
Low level art. And it would be more a high level art that is what Calvinists, so those who are maturing in the religion aspect of their human existence, are not going to be satisfied or are going to desire that low level art anymore. So it wasn't actually that it was just art in general that they didn't like or wanted to do away with. It was they had this sense like, well, it needs to mature. There's a higher beauty or a higher form of this thing that needs to happen. And that's kind of what he tries in this first section. At least, again, it was a tough slugging to see what his point was, but that seemed to be the point.
No, and that's right. So I think what I understood as I trudged along is understanding history here. Like he's assuming a certain level of knowledge of history here. So, Calvin and the Protestant Reformation begins to get going. People's theology begins to get reformed. They're seeing God and the attributes of God in totally different ways. And what was the art that was around them? Well, it was either completely pagan or is completely Catholic, which was
idolatrous.
So there was no art for them to embrace. They had to reject it because it was either idolatrous or pagan by nature. And so, as they were matured and as they grew, well, they were focusing on their theology, on their religion, and on their sanctification, all those kinds of things. There was a natural progression to now we've matured to the place where we'll create art that glorifies God, right? So they had to reject art that didn't glorify God, and he talks about that. But what it ought to do is it ought to mature us to the place where now we are making art that does glorify God.
Yeah, I think he tries to show that in history there are these developments. Yeah. And so to look at one guy like Calvin who lived, I think he was 55, and to look to him alone for a Calvinism and art ideal, you're kind of narrowing yourself to that. So you got to open it up, look at the historical developments and see how these things mature. Yeah. I think one thing he was trying to point out here at the beginning too, again, I was trying to distill this here, but that God is the standard of all art, and that, well, he's the standard of beauty for all things, right? And he kind of does point to creation, and he's like, go to the Alps and you'll see this beauty and stuff. And so then God becomes the standard of beauty there. So that inherently rejects postmodernism, which is beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Yes. And that there is a standard of beauty, though. There is things that are not beautiful, even if a bunch of people say it is. Right. It doesn't mean it is. It's supposed to be reflected against God's beauty. There's a great, if I could encourage anybody, if anybody wants to study just this theme of God as the standard for beauty, the first essay in the collection of 4 essays by C.S. Lewis, that's called, it's called The Abolition of Man. Okay. And the first essay in it, called The Abolition of Man, is C.S. Lewis is talking about subjectivity and objectivity in art. And it's interesting. So he talks about, there's this school book where it talks about, somebody says, oh, that waterfall is sublime. And they say, well, what that person is not saying is that waterfall is actually sublime. What they mean when they say that is that waterfall evokes feelings of sublimeness in me, right? So it's that idea that I look at that, and then what matters is how it makes me feel. And that's that whole subjective beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And C.S. Lewis just dismantles it. But that's the point there is that not everything is beautiful, right? There's ugliness in the world. Sin is in the world. The fall is here. And so we it's the job of the Christian
we were talking macro job to beautify, right? To beautify the world.
Yeah.
When God created the garden and mandated for Adam to go and take dominion, he was saying, go and make the rest of the world Eden. Well, the rest of the world was a wilderness. The rest of the world, the rest of the world was not a beautiful garden. He was saying, I've created the raw materials. I've shown you what's beautiful. Go and beautify the rest of the world.
Yep.
And so there's a standard there that's inescapable. And so music, right?
Right.
Visual art, painting, all that kind of stuff, play, movie, all that kind of stuff. There's a standard that is good, and that standard is God.
Which will reflect his law, so his morality.
That's right.
And then that also means that we need to reject forms of art as beautiful, but that are chaotic.
That's right.
And so a lot of abstract art or even music styles, right? I used to absolutely love metal, hardcore and stuff. And that can be beautiful and done really well. Yep. But then I've listened to tons of music that's absolutely chaotic. There's nothing discernible that is beautiful or skillful in it. But I know there's that postmodern tendency to appreciate chaos.
Yeah.
And want to appreciate the thing that makes no sense.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that's so different, or that's so, or whatever. And like, I know that temptation as a kid raised in just a postmodern thinking world, and that needs to be rejected. No, that's not good. That doesn't accord with reality.
That's right. Know? And that might sound, I mean, especially, I hate to say this, but a lot of people who are very artsy can sometimes be very finicky about what is and isn't beautiful, right? They care more about art, and they're more educated on art than I am. But the reality is that that might push on you a little bit to say there are things that are objectively beautiful and things that are objectively ugly according to God's standard. But I mean, so you might look at something like, well, flower, right? Everybody would say, oh, a flower is beautiful. And the postmodernists would say, well, flowers aren't beautiful. Well, Jesus clearly thought that flowers were objectively beautiful, because he didn't talk about a particular type of flower. He talked about flowers that are more beautifully dressed than even kings in all their splendor, right? So God or Jesus appealed to the objective standard of beauty, looking at creation. Yeah. And so we have to be taught by Jesus himself and see all that, right? So
it's good.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep slugging.
All right.
So
when he talks about Calvinism not producing its own distinct art style,
right?
I found this super interesting, because when you live in one area of the world, you just don't really think about other areas of the world a lot of times.
Yep.
And even though I've been to other areas of the world, but because that's one of the accusations against Calvinism and art, is that, well, they never developed their own distinct art style. You can't look at a certain building and go, oh, that's a Calvinist building. And
it's sturdy.
It's right. Nice and strong. It chose you to go inside. But he talks about a bunch of different areas of the world where, when you think of them, whatever was common to that area helped it develop its own style of art.
Right.
Whether it leaned towards architecture or music or writing or something, and like weather patterns would matter here. You know, and I think with the Netherlands, he says, all we have is clay. So
there's only so much you can.
So that would be the one, thing that they could have developed. Well, what was that in Geneva? What's that in, Scotland? What's that in Africa?
Right.
So that was helpful to at least understand the development of certain art styles. And I think he even points to how this is what's so cool about God making the world have so many different climates and stuff, is that it would produce so many different kinds of art styles, and that all of them reflect, the nature and character of God in a different way, and that you can appreciate 50 different kinds of art rather than, no, here's the only one art style that is good and right, clay. Right. Rather than marble and metal or whatever. All those things can be, you can be artistic with them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think you can see how even all of the themes that we've been talking about through these lectures are still embedded here. So there's, number one, there's freedom, right? And there's liberty. It's not a prescribed art form, right? This is beautiful. This is what you ought to build with. This was, again, there's liberty that all of this comes with, but also that God loves diversity, right? And so you're talking about that there's all of this depending on culture, depending on, environment, depending on geography, these different art forms are going to spring up because God loves diversity, right?
Well, that's his Trinitarian imprint on the world,
That's
right?
good. Yeah, it's really good.
That's what it makes me think of when I think of him just making things so diverse like that. Those are good things. They shouldn't all look the same. They shouldn't all be the same. And the diversity is a good thing to have many different kinds. I mean, look at all the animals. He made many kinds of trees, many kinds of fruits, many flavors in the world. All this stuff reflects that Trinitarian, that, many persons in the one Godhead. That's his imprint on creation.
And so you think about even just visual art and you're like, okay, so God's made all the colors, right? Now there's that liberty of like go and do stuff with them, right? God spoke his word, or like revealed himself through words. Now here are all these beautiful words, go and do something with them, right? There's this sort of, he's created the raw material for us to go and create things that reflect his glory, right?
Yeah, the ore is just inside mountains. Right. Go get it. Go build a skyscraper.
That's right.
Here's a bunch of flowers. Some of them are dye for clothes. That's how you get purple clothes.
Some of them,
it's cool.
Some of them will cure diseases. Some of them will dye your clothes. Go figure it out. And
right. That's cool.
So he goes in and he kind of turns to consider how art fits the worldview of Calvinism. And he starts by sort of reminding us that religion must stay in its place, right? So he says, however holy religion may be, it must keep within its own bounds, lest in crossing its lines, it degenerate into superstition, insanity, and fanaticism.
That's good.
So again, he's still, and he quotes John Calvin right after that when he says, all the arts come from God and are to be respected as divine inventions. So again, you have this acknowledgement that God is the source of all things, but that religion doesn't swallow up freedom of all the various aspects that God has given to us in the world in which we live.
Yeah, that's good. And maybe... And I might be jumping ahead, but then that gives value to everyone's artistic expression in a way.
Right.
Where,
not in the way that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but like it gives the different value to those who, and we all know these people, right? Yeah. The people who respond to music, the people who respond to written word, the people who respond to whatever, or musical expressions, right?
Right. And that's, since God is the giver of these artistic abilities, then could be anybody in a sense, right? And he does sort of get into that later with an implication of the doctrine of election is that God electing an individual, like that person, not just the higher ups, but that art isn't just reserved for a special class, or the abilities are just for a special class of people. And so if you just get yourself into this class of society, now your art is accepted or your art is worthy or something.
Right.
But it's that those gifts have been given all over the world to all these different people. And anyway.
Yeah, no, it's good. Sorry, I'm just kind of looking down to, again, trudging through.
I know,
right?
it was hard to just sum up in a way, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. This is the quote that I was looking for, though. This is on 155. And he's basically saying that art is not really a subjective work. We've been talking about this in terms of everything, but it says God is basically setting the boundaries of art, which is what we've been saying. But here's the quote that I wanted to read.
Okay.
If God is and remains sovereign, then art can work no enhancement except in keeping with the ordinances which God ordained for the beautiful, when he, as the supreme artist, called this world into existence. And then just a little bit down, he says, all this is because the beautiful is not the production of our own fantasy, nor of our subjective perception, but has an objective existence, being itself the expression of a divine perfection. So there's him kind of putting that beauty's in the eye of the beholder to rest in a way that only Kuyper can.
Yeah, and it says page 156, I think just after what you read. As God, he alone is the original one. We are only the bearers of his image. Our capacity to create after him and after what he created can only consist in the unreal creations of art. So we, in our fashion, may imitate God's handiwork. Yeah. And so, yeah, again, that just, I mean, not only does that give you an incredible motivation to create stuff,
right?
But it does destroy the postmodern substancelessness of creation too, right? Their worldview of chaos and there's no structure can't create anything good. It can't create something of substance or lasting value.
Right.
And one thing that when it comes to artistic masterpieces, before the Reformation, where are the cathedrals?
Yeah.
Where it took them hundreds of years to build some of these amazing cathedrals, and all the details and everything, they're built to make you look up to heaven. Like there's thought put into every little detail.
The columns are built in threes to remind you that God is triune. Like there's so much intricacy. And then you contrast that with, I can't even remember where it was, but you remember the postmodern building that was erected in some university in the States.
Yeah, it was Ohio or Indiana or something like that.
And one of those godless places. But it had doors that went nowhere, staircases that just hit the
dropped
ceiling,
off,
all that kind of stuff. And I remember there was one Christian apologist who was saying, the person's kind of bragging about this, life has no meaning, and so therefore
of postmodernism or something like that.
And he kind of looked and quipped, does it have a foundation? Right, like the point is,
did you guys do the foundation the same way as you did all this?
Exactly, because it doesn't actually work, because that worldview doesn't work, and so. Art that is reflecting a chaotic and unstructured reality eventually is not only not beautiful, but it doesn't actually work.
Well, it's like even abstract art is on a flat canvas that's a square.
Right.
That's not just paint thrown out in the air. Like you still have to have a foundation or a substance. Yeah. It's funny.
Okay, so there were a couple of quotes that we did want to get to kind of near the end.
Okay.
And
the final point is really good
really good. And
go ahead with your...
Well, he's talking about how Calvinism promotes art, right? And so he basically says that Calvinism sees art as a gift of common grace to all men, right? And so he says, this is on page 160, Calvinism, on the contrary, has taught us that all liberal arts are gifts which God imparts to believers and to unbelievers. Yea, that, as history shows, these gifts have flourished even in a larger measure outside the holy circle. So this is common grace, which then kind of, I guess, begs the question, can art be used in an evangelical way? Can art be used to reflect the gospel? And we ought to say, Calvinism is a world and life view. Yes, it can. Not only can it, but out of necessity it should.
Right.
So our responsibility to disciple the nations also means we ought to disciple the nations on how to do art correctly in a way that reflects the great story, the great narrative.
I think this is where Christian culture gets tripped up many times. And I think about movies where a typical Christian movie is going to end with a gospel invitation, and the person responds in this powerful response of yes, of course, and everything perfectly comes together. But two things are wrong in there. Is that one, well, is it a Christian movie? Well, yeah, because they told the gospel at the end. That's what makes it a Christian movie. And I would not agree with that. That's the only way that it can be a Christian movie. Also, that every time you share the gospel, there's a positive response.
Right.
That often is not the case when you share
Yeah.
the gospel. But you think about, a movie can reflect God's character or reflect the gospel story if you just write a story where the bad guy isn't the one who wins.
Yeah.
Simple.
Yep.
That story glorified the story of the Bible. If it's just a story where the bad guy doesn't win, there's a lot of themes like that through movies or books or what have you that can reflect a more biblical understanding of reality and of the gospel story that makes it Christian.
Yeah. I don't know why my mind wandered this way, but have you seen The Usual Suspects?
No.
At the end, the bad guy's kind of getting away.
Yeah.
Right? He's just walking away like he got away with it. And I was just repicturing the end to glorify God and just picturing like a thumb comes down and just
Smash.
squishes him. It's just like, oh, the whole movie, nope.
Yeah.
And there are ways, again, and this is the interesting thing, right? Why are we drawn to, and I don't care what people are going to say about gender stuff. Girls love princesses.
Yes.
Boys love knights.
Right.
We are drawn to stories where knights slay dragons and get the girl because that's the story, right? Around your Sabbath table, the last question the kids answer right before we all sing the doxology is, what's the big story of the Bible, right? Kill the dragon, get the girl.
That's the point of the whole Bible. Right.
Because that's what Christ did. He came to cut the head off the dragon, right? Crush the head of the snake and win his bride.
Exactly.
And so we love those kinds of stories because they reflect the true story. And so when we talk about how there's an objective standard of beauty, it comes from the story God is telling, the way God has made the world. And God has made the world in such a way that good guys win, bad guys lose, right? Justice happens. There's mercy, there's grace, right? All of those themes are biblical and beautiful. And if our stories and our art don't reflect that, then they're not worth anything.
Yeah. I want to plug something, and maybe not every video is beneficial, but there's a guy named Jonathan Peugeot. If you look him up, he does a podcast called The Symbolic World, and he actually goes through some movie themes in Disney movies or even like Batman, The Dark Knight and stuff. And he's an Eastern Orthodox guy. He's very conservative though, and very biblically minded. And it's really interesting to watch some of his stuff and hear him like retell the theme and tie it to either a story in the Bible or something like that. And it's super interesting, but it shows you how a story can seem neutral or unassuming, but then if you look at it closer, that it's completely godless.
Right.
And you're like, whoa, that doesn't line up with anything biblical. Or like Batman, The Dark Knight, you're like, what can be, Christian about that? And not that Christopher Nolan is a Christian or anything, but you see this theme and you're like, whoa, that totally lines up with the gospel or with what Jesus has done or something like that.
It's interesting because now is maybe a good time to also plug, because we've been talking the last couple of weeks about family integrated worship and even just family worship and just discipling kids.
Yeah.
One of the things that we try to do at our house, I know you guys have done this a little bit as well, is we play the game Spot the Lie.
Yep.
Right. So, and those are opportunities, right? And you told me about that guy in his podcast, and I watched the one on Moana.
Yeah.
Oh man. I watched. I was just like, oh my word! Like, what is? And
no spoilers, guys. Go watch it.
Yeah. But you look at some of the symbolism that's being used and what it's conveying subliminally to your kids and all this kind of stuff. And these are great opportunities for us as parents to disciple your kids to see beauty by God's standard. Right. So whether it's a movie, whether it's music, whether it's a show, whether it's art, whatever it is, when you spot those inconsistencies with the narrative of history, with God's story, pause. Take those as opportunities to disciple your kids.
Yeah.
Right?
Help them think Christianly.
That's right.
About even the entertainment they take in.
That's right.
And I think so N.D. Wilson, who's written a ton of children's fiction adventure books and made a few movies. This is Pastor Doug Wilson's kid, and Doug Wilson has written a bunch of fiction too. And It's great.
Yeah,
N.D.
it's really
Wilson's
good.
stuff is really good. Though it's made for like 7 to 12 aged boys, I really love it.
But even so, he also did Hello Ninja, and
Yes.
for anybody who still has Netflix, it's even on
Yep.
Netflix. And like, it's not Christian. The kids don't pray or like,
Right.
there's not. But he's reflecting, this
All the virtues
yeah,
of godliness.
boys being boys, girls being girls, like showing the world as it is,
Right.
while they're playing and having fun and pretending to be ninjas.
Right.
Like it's
without the worldly fussiness or the assumed irritation that a sister and brother have to have with each other. 'Cause that's what I've noticed with most art when it comes to videos or stories, that brothers and sisters just always have to be irritated with each other.
Yeah.
I'm like, why is this the case?
And why is like every sitcom, the mom wears the pants, the dad's a deadbeat who's always
Right.
getting in trouble, is hiding things from the wife, all that kind
Well,
of
and like
stuff.
we
right?
said, we're chasing after this atrophy of material. We're chasing after that void.
Yeah.
And that's why all of the sin and stuff is being displayed in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So at the end, I just
Yeah.
want to make this point that Calvinism at least like freed art. So for the longest time, it was either controlled by the church, the Roman Catholic Church that controlled most of Europe. And then, but then under Calvinism, which gives this freedom to man under the sovereignty of God, living before the face of God, gives this freedom now to art. So maybe the Calvinists of this time, Calvin himself or whoever, didn't produce the art. They paved the way, or at least opened that road up for others to come down and create art according to that worldview.
Right.
I thought that was
cleared
really
the
good.
space for the Lewises and the Chestertons and the Leonardos and all that. Read that quote. You have that teed up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he says, page 166, it has frequently been remarked, moreover, that the idea of election by free grace has contributed not a little toward interesting art in the hidden importance of what was seemingly small and insignificant. If a common man, to whom the world pays no special attention, is valued and even chosen by God as one of his elect, this must lead the artist also to find a motive for his artistic studies in what is common and of everyday occurrence, to pay attention to the emotions and the issues of the human heart in it, to grasp with his artistic instinct their ideal impulse, and lastly, by his pencil, to interpret for the world at large the precious discovery he has made.
So good.
It just gives so much value to that common man, which gives such richness to his life.
And then just for the flip side, because he goes on to say, and I think this is important too, he talks about how kind of sorrow and suffering in the world points to and highlights the suffering of Jesus in his ministry on the cross. And so he says, just a little bit down from there, he says, and if thus far the eyes of all had been fixed constantly and solely upon the sufferings of the man of sorrows, some now began to understand that there was a mystical suffering also in the general woe of man, revealing hitherto unmeasured depths of the human heart, and thereby enabling us to fathom much better the still deeper depths of the mysteries of the mysterious agonies of Golgotha.
Wow!
And so there's this power that art has to show all aspects of God's creation, but only when it's in submission to God's creational norms and God's grand narrative. And I guess that's the point to leave it with, is that whether it's the high highs or the low lows, and the gospel is certainly plenty of full of both, it still our art still has to be in submission to that grand narrative, showing the right aspects of both the right and the wrong of the world.
It's good.
Yeah. So
art's good.
Art's good
when it obeys God's law.
Amen. Amen.
God's law.
There you go. That's all we could have. Yeah. If you made it through 35 minutes just to see that at the end. Interestingly, I think we were both at the start of this kind of saying like, oh, this was a tough one. Like this one might not be that long. But once you get talking about it, you realize how much it touches.
Right.
And so this is the importance of going through this kind of stuff together.
Right.
So keep asking your questions, reach out, let us know how, what sort of things you come to in this, and talk to somebody about it. Find out, look at who likes the video and go chat with them about it so that you can figure out who else is going through this stuff, because talking it through, I think helps pull out some practical implications for our lives. So
it's awesome.
was there any others? So you mentioned N.D. Wilson. I just got to say, his Notes from the Tilt-A-Whirl.
Okay, haven't read that yet.
I was about to chastise everybody. No, go read Notes from the Tilt-A-Whirl. You. It's just one of the most beautiful, and N.D. Wilson is really reflecting on creation and art as a reflection of God, and it's just it's phenomenal. And then the other thing I was going to say, so we didn't touch a whole lot on visual art, on painting and all that kind of stuff, because neither of us are really wired to love that. But there's a great book by Nancy Piercy, who spoke at the Mission of God conference a couple years ago, called Saving Leonardo.
Okay.
Phenomenal book. If you're interested in visual art and painting and all that kind of stuff, pick up that book. And she takes all of this, like she was obviously very steeped in Kuyper, and she kind of relates it to visual art, and it's really, really good as well. Anything else you wanted to plug in terms of resources?
No, N.D. Wilson, just start buying up all his books. As far as like fiction and art that way, as far as creating stories, it's phenomenal.
And I mentioned, I can't remember where I mentioned this. I mentioned it somewhere on one of these videos, but I'm just reading Chronicles of Narnia to Quinn. Like, read C.S. Lewis, right? Tolkien. For adult stuff, read Chesterton, right? Like
John Bunyan.
Read Pilgrim's Progress to your kids. Like, there's good stories there, and steep your kids in good stories, because let's be honest, they want to watch Paw Patrol or Polly Pocket or whatever else is on. Fill them with good stories that are going to fill their head with Bible, as opposed to whatever else they're filling up on in the world. All right.
Awesome. Cool.
Good stuff. Thanks for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed this one. We'll be back for the last lecture.
Calvinism and the Future. Really excited about that one.
Yeah, it's a good one. And then after that, we'll do a Q&A. So if you started collecting questions, send them our way, and we'll do a Q&A at the end of it all. So,
perfect.
All right. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Bye.